I studied Foucault and Marcuse relations, and for now I am interested to present to you some ideas about how Foucault is close to critical theory and why Foucault sometimes is different from critical theory. The question is, Foucault is a critical theorist or not? Yeah, and I think that in my dissertation that was this kind of tension between Marcuse and Foucault, but because at first time we can start with this point, we can remember some critics that Foucault uh, uh, do work against Marcuse. In History of Sexuality, for example, there is a chapter, the first volume, there is a chapter when Foucault writes about the against the repressive hypothesis. He didn't name it Marcuse in this point, but if you see another lectures, Foucault lectures, like society must be defended. He is direct against Marcuse. I will quote this part when Foucault remembers some of the studies in history of sexuality, and he's expressed these words. This has been a period characterized by what we might call the efficacy of dispersed and discontinuous offensives. This is a part of genealogy of power, no? And he continues. I also think in this he classify a lot other points, but I I remark this one. I'm also thinking, said Foucault, of the strange efficacy of the attacks that have been made on, would just say, morality and the traditional sexual hierarchy. They too referred in only vague and distant terms to right or Marcuse. And that's an interesting point because Marcuse, if you remember Eros and Civilization, he has a critical part on Freud and the repressive questions of Freud. And Marcuse is thinking about another kind of civilization, a civilization without repression. That is a direct critic against fundamental fundaments of psychoanalysis. And Foucault is against this perspective, not because he agrees with Freud, but because he doesn't think about a kind of power that is a negative power, like the repressive, positive power that repressed another kind of power that is repressed, and it's a kind of negative power. Power for Foucault is a kind of relationship between forces that is every time against each other. Okay? And that's an important part of my perspective because we can say then Foucault is against critical theory or a kind of critical theory, and that's the part that we can discuss more about. But we can remember another older text of Foucault, older texts, when he said in amazing parts that I liked so much, one interview with Gerard Rollet, when Foucault said, I quote, "If I had been familiar with the Frankfurt School, if I had been aware of it at the time, I would not have said a number of stupid things that I did say, and I would have avoided many of the detours which I made while trying to pursue my own humble path. When meanwhile avenues have been opened up by the Frankfurt School, it's as It's a strange case for it's Foucault too. It's a strange case of non-penetration between two very similar types of thinking, which is explained perhaps by that very similarity. Nothing hides the fact of a problem in a common better than two similar ways of approaching it. That is, there is a kind of perspective of Foucault and the critical theory that makes them together. Uh, that's the kind of perspective that I would like to develop more, because here if you see on the one hand, Foucault is criticizing Eros civilization of Marcuse, but not, on the other hand, he is close to dialectic of enlightenment of Adorno and on the Horkheimer. Uh, mainly the question of we can see now questions of domination, rationalization, and technique that is developed in dialects of enlightenment. And I think that is important text of Foucault, important text. Another one is what is critique. It's a presentation that Foucault made, a lecture of Foucault's lecture in United States, and it's a very interesting part because he is thinking a lot about Kantian perspectives and what is the meaning of critique for him. And the first part of this lecture, Foucault said, "What is critique?" And he answered, and critique is the art of the not being governed quite so much. That's a very interesting perspective because we have a kind of epistemological critic, but Foucault here is connecting with politics and epistemological perspectives. Uh, and what he would like to say about it, it's not a question of anarchy or against the all government. That's a very important point that Foucault is writing. Uh, we can see, for example, when he follow, the question is not to defend an anarchy, but the critical question is to put, I quote Foucault here, forth universal and indefeasible rights to which every government, whatever it may be, whether a monarchy, a magistrate, an educator, or a paterfamilias, will have to submit. It's a kind of critique of every kind of subjugation or every kind of government that appears in the modernity against the models of government. Then that's why Foucault associates critique and the art of not being government quite so much. Uh, I can read another part of this conference of this lecture, and Foucault said, I quote, "Critique will be the art of the voluntary insubordination." The voluntary insubordination is a very important paradox. Critical would be essentially ensure critical would be essentially ensure the desubjugation of the subject in the context of what we could call, in a word, the politics of truth. And again, a question that is very important. Critique is not is against all of forms of government, but to put limits to this government in the modernity. Foucault follows this interesting conference, what is critique, and associates this terms of critique in Kantian terms with Aufklärung to the Enlightenment. And that's another part very important of this text when Foucault finally associates, he makes a historical perspective of the development of enlightenment in German and France, and he sees the present moment when he is living now, and the 20th century, when some perspectives of German Enlightenment appears in French philosophy, and he is himself connecting with this development. Okay, and it's a very important part because when he associates critique as enlightenment, following Kant in these terms, he is connecting knowledge and power too, and as a grid. It's not a question of two elements that are in a separate way, but they are connected. And the knowledge and power are grid to understand another phenomenon, historical phenomena. That's why, for example, he is not analyzing the madness as a substance of the madness in the history, but the madness as a dispositive of power and knowledge. Okay, and following these terms, we can see this development of enlightenment of Clairon in German scene and the French scene. And I will quote this perspective. In any case, from the Hegelian, I quoted here Foucault. In any case, from the Hegelian left to the Frankfurt School, there has been a complete critique of positivism, objectivism, rationalization of technique and technicalization, a whole critique of the relationships between the fundamental project of science and techniques, whose objective was to show the connections between science's naive presumptions on one hand and the forms of domination characteristics of contemporary society on the other. That's a very important part that Foucault here is describing himself uh, closer to Frankfurt schools. And this terms is very Marcusian terms and very Adorno and Horkheimer terms too. Okay, and he follows the scene in France. Uh, by the I quote here, by a strange shortcut, the problem between ratio and power was discovered in the scene of knowledge and of Clairon of enlightenment. And then we have the reciprocal and inverse problem of that of Clairon. How is that rationalization leads to the furor of power? And he is a very important part of Foucault because he is reading Frankfurt School close to him in order to say that now the problem is not the rationalization by itself, but how rationalization impels new forms of power. That's a present concept in Adorno and Horkheimer dialects of enlightenment and Marcuse one-dimensional man. That's for me it's very important, a parenthesis, sorry, because if you see Foucault is criticizing Marcuse in terms of Eros and Civilization. That's a book on 1955, and One-Dimensional Man appears some years later with a kind of auto-critique. Marcuse make an auto-critique of some of perspectives of Earth's civilization, and he is seeing now one-dimensional society that makes a kind of not more a repressive power like this, like he described in Eros Civilization, but a kind of liberation of freedom, a system of consume that Marcuse is seeing in the society in United States in one-dimensional man. And now repressive power is not the most important part. The repressive like a superpower that repressive everything, but the repression is spread on the society. Okay, like that's a kind of way to think concept, Marcuse's concept of repressive sublimation. That's not a repressive structure, but we internalize some kind of repressive structures, and the liberation, for example, is a kind of repressive way to think, way to live inside the society of opulence, affluence, like Marcuse said. Okay, just 3 points then to start to finish. Uh, well, it's very important then to think what Foucault is organizing here. There are some implications that Foucault describes in these lectures in What is Critique. The first one is some kind of connection, very interesting connection, that Foucault said this kind of critique of enlightenment presented in German scene is a kind of desubjectivation. Okay, he said, for example, uh, I quote, actually, in this historical philosophical practice that he is thinking about dialectic of enlightenment, one has to make one's honest history, fabricate history, as if through fiction, in terms of how it would be traversed by the question of the relationships between structures of rationality, which articulate true discourse, and the mechanisms of subjugation which are linked to it. That's very a connection between the way of he is describing himself as philosopher, Foucault, in terms of archaeology, in terms of he is seeing how the fictions are construction, the two, okay, and that's a way to think how it's connected with some parts of dialects of enlightenment, as a way to think not the universal history of in Hegelian terms of an absolute universal mind, okay, but a kind of process that is constructs subjects, and we can see it in terms of Marcuse, and in terms of Adorno, and in terms of Foucault. Another perspective and is made by Foucault is genealogy. It's another perspective. And Foucault says, I quote, let us say wholly that as opposed to a genesis oriented towards the unity of some principal cause burdened with multiple descendants, what is proposed instead is a genealogy, that is, something that attempts to restore the conditions for the appearance of a singularity born out of multiple determining elements of which it's not the product, but rather the effect. That's the important part. Foucault is describing the genealogy of power here, and how he is thinking about. It's a kind of thinking without a substance, without an origin. It's a effects. It's a production of effects that transform each other, the phenomena, uh, transforming the phenomena, the historical experiences every time, and it creates forces and counter forces that interested Foucault, and we can see it in the manner of Adorno, and maybe, I don't know, Marcuse too, uh, against a kind of a dialects without origin, without substance, a fundamental substance. And it's Foucault, Adorno will describe a kind of negative dialects in these terms, against, for example, Heideggerian perspectives of an essence, authenticity, and so on and so forth. And that's another connection that Foucault makes about it. And uh, in connection with this idea, the way that Foucault will write about it is a strategy. Is another perspective that Foucault is describing here, because that's not a kind of two separate elements. As I said, knowledge for one side, the knowledge and the power on the other side, but it's connection. It's related, and it's an interaction that appears here. Foucault said his the critique way criticism is in a perpetual slippage from one another, knowledge and power. Each interaction can be, I quote here Foucault again, each interaction can be resituated in a context that exceeds it, and conversely, however local it may be, it has an effect or possible effect on the interaction oh, uh, to it belongs and by which it is enveloped. There is a kind of interaction between these perspectives. That is, there is not a kind of substance. And another way to think is against Habermas' perspectives on Foucault. It's not a performative contradiction, because Habermas has this kind of critique. He said Foucault, when he think about power, he is absolutize power as a big power that anybody can escape from. Okay, and that's a similar critique that Habermas made against Adorno and Horkheim in Philosophy of History. For example, the rationalization of a kind of philosophy of nature that appears in Adorno or even Marcuse. That's a kind of contradiction, a performative contradiction. We are fighting against the rationalization, but we are inside this rationalization. Then it's a kind of looping that we cannot escape from. And that's the part. That's the important part, because here I think Foucault elucidates some kind of a different way to think uh, when he said he's not a kind of critique or against substance of this reason, of this power, but it's a kind of strategy, how we can mobilize with our critique inside this relation of power, or of this kind of rationalization, so on and so forth. Then that's the three parts that I can said that is connected between Foucault and critical theory by this lecture, Foucault lectures, What is Critique? the archaeology and kinds of new form to think, fabricated history, this kind of genealogy of power. We can see the movement of reason, but the counter reason appearing in this in this kind of dialects in terms of Adorno and Marcuse, but in terms of in Nietzschean terms, in kind of forces that impels the phenomena to transform each other, and this kind of strategy to think critique as a strategy. And just to finish, we can think maybe this strange connection that I made, because it's very, very uh, strange to think, Foucault is closer to dialectics. It's very, very strange. That's not the point for me. Foucault is not a dialectical thinker. He is against dialects, but it's interesting to think why he is he is thinking about it. And for me, the perspective is, if you think the history of dialects in times of after Auschwitz, we can think the movement that is present in dialects of enlightenment, or even Adorno older works, negative dialects, that a kind of necessity to dialectics to rethink itself against a negative form, to think a older kind of critique of ideology. And that's not more a kind of disalienation of the thinking. It's not so simple like that. After Auschwitz, it's very interesting to think the effects of this new forms of ideology, as cynicism, for example. And Adorno and Marcuse is thinking how it's possible to think dialects, how we can criticize this kind of phenomena. It impels, for example, Adorno to rethink dialects in a negative dialects. And if you read Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, we can remember the introductory chapter of One-Dimensional Man, when he is saying about a paralyzed criticism and the necessity to rethink criticism. What I want to say here is dialects is the terms of dialects is changing now. And Foucault, it's very interesting in this part, because for me, Foucault is choosing another way. He's not choosing a dialectical way. He is rejecting dialectics. When we can remember here the Foucault inaugural speech on Collège de France, the order of discourse, and he is saying he's thinking about Jean Hippolyte influence on his works, and he's saying how to escape from Hegel. It's a difficult way to think. And Foucault, what's the point? For Foucault, the point is the kind of we cannot think more in a negative perspective, because this kind of negative is a kind of how I can say, a kind of problematic way to think that everybody has his say. It's an interesting part. It presupposes this kind of movement of negative that Jean Hippolyte is trying to escape from it every time, but for Foucault it's impossible. He says it presupposes a knowledge. Hippolyte, this movement of Hippolyte presupposes knowledge of what is still Hegelian, in that which allows us to think against Hegel. And Foucault is describing Marx against Hegel, Fichte against Hegel, our history of philosophy, even Adorno against Hegel, we can say, and even Marcuse too. But he in this part he doesn't quote Adorno and Marcuse, but we can think about it, and I will follow. Then he presupposes a knowledge of what is still Hegelian in that which allows us to think against Hegel, and an ability to gauge how much our resources against him are perhaps still a huge which is using against us, and at the end of which he is waiting for us, immobile and elsewhere. It's a kind of inescapable Hegel that is appears every time. And for Foucault, that's an important part. Negation is just appearance. It's doxology, like Foucault said in Archaeology of Knowledge. For Foucault, he is interested for another way to think that abandoned dialects as a way to think, because it's just a doxology. And he is thinking about strategy. He is thinking about positive forms of forces. That's why he is thinking about forces and counter forces, apparatuses, and dispositives of power, discursive practices, and so on and so forth. Uh, that's an important part. Then Foucault, for example, has a lot of connections with critical theory, in terms that I said, the archaeology, history, the way to criticize rationalization, but he's thinking another strategy that abandon dialectics, and I think that's an important part to discuss here. If Foucault, when he abandoned dialectics, his critical theorist yet or not, or what is the implications of this abandonment of dialects in critical theory. It puts another questions to critical theory. For example, how to think history today, how to think the colonial theories, and Foucault is very important just to the colonial theories, for example, and in terms of critical theories, old school, Frankfurt School critical theory, and that's some kind of perspectives that I would like to share with you to discuss after. Thank you so much, Jeremiah and Krishna, Samir, for this opportunity to share these ideas, and I hope this can help us to think